The dust carried the taste of copper and grit as the stagecoach rattled down Cedar Ridge's main street. The sun hung low, turning the wooden facades of the saloon and mercantile into silhouettes against an endless burning sky. Silas Kane stood, waiting at the edge of the crowd, one calloused hand gripping the brim of his hat, the other tucked into the belt of his worn duster. He'd come to collect a promise, a new beginning in the form of a mail-order bride whose letters smelled faintly of lavender and spoke of soft hands and quiet laughter. But when the wagon halted and the driver swung the door open, it wasn't innocence that stepped down. The woman's boots hit the dirt with a thud, her skirts black as midnight trimmed with crimson lace. A single curl of copper hair slipped from beneath her hat and caught the dying sun like fire. Her gaze swept the crowd, sharp and wary. Her painted lips set in a line that warned trouble followed close behind. A murmur rippled through Cedar Ridge. "Lord Almighty," someone whispered near the general store. "Ain't that Violet Monroe?" Even Silas, who'd spent most of his years avoiding town gossip, knew the name. Violet Monroe, the infamous madam from Dodge City. A woman men whispered about after too much whiskey. A woman chased out of 2 territories and rumored to have shot a preacher in Kansas. But here she was, stepping off the wagon that was supposed to deliver Eleanor, the gentle Norwegian bride who was meant to fix his broken home and soothe the ache left by years of loneliness. Silas's jaw tightened. This was not what he'd paid for. Silas Kane, a man with a past Silas, had once been a man of laughter, a younger rancher with calloused hands and a heart wide enough to swallow the prairie sky. But the land had a way of grinding men down. First came the droughts, then the cattle fever that swept through his herd, and finally the winter blizzard that took his wife and unborn son 6 years back. Since then, silence filled the Kane ranch, broken only by the restless creak of wind against rotting barnwood and the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance. The letters from Eleanor had been salvation, short at first, formal, almost timid. Then warmer as the months passed, painting pictures of a future Silas had almost forgotten how to dream about. Mornings filled with soft voices instead of loneliness, laughter over supper, children learning to ride along the fence line. And now, instead of Eleanor, he had Violet Monroe, a woman whose very name carried a weight of scandal heavy enough to bury him if the town's judgment didn't first. Violet Monroe. Running from shadows, Violet kept her chin high as Cedar Ridge's stairs burned against her back. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let them see it. She'd lived through worse. Back alleys in Dodge City, whiskey-soaked saloon floors, the hands of men who thought gold bought anything, even dignity. She hadn't planned on ending up here. The wagon had been meant for Eleanor, yes, but Violet had slipped aboard under cover of night, trading her last coins to a driver too tired to ask questions. Dodge City had become a death trap after she'd crossed Frank Carraway, a gambler turned outlaw with a temper that burned hotter than Texas summer. She'd taken something that didn't belong to her, not just his money, but something worse. Violet had 3 days, maybe less, before Carraway or his boys rode her down. Cedar Ridge was supposed to be a hiding place. She hadn't expected Silas Kane's steel-gray eyes steady as a drawn colt, watching her with suspicion instead of fear. The town's judgment. The preacher was the first to approach Silas, his black coat billowing like a crow's wings. This is who you sent for?" he demanded, voice sharp enough to cut. "No," Silas said flatly, gaze never leaving Violet. "It ain't." "Then send her back," the preacher snapped. "A woman like her's a plague on decent folk. She's sin made flesh." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Men spat into the dirt. Women clutched their children's shoulders, shielding young eyes as though Violet herself carried ruin in her skirts. Violet let them talk, let them glare. She'd been hated before. She'd learned how to wear disdain like armor. But Silas wasn't so certain. The Kane name wasn't much, but what little reputation he had left couldn't afford scandal. Yet when Violet's eyes met his, guarded, defiant, but hiding a shadow of fear, something in him hesitated. A bargain struck that night. In the lamplit quiet of the Kane Ranch kitchen, Silas set his terms. "You can stay," he said, voice low and steady. but only until the bride I sent for shows up. You work, you keep your head down, and when she gets here, you move on. Violet's laugh was soft and bitter. Work, keep my head down, stay quiet. Sounds like a dream rancher. But she agreed. What choice did she have? The desert offered no mercy, and the roads behind her were painted with blood she couldn't scrub clean. Closing cliffhanger days later, as Violet fed the chickens in the pale morning light, she heard the distant rumble of hooves. Silas stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. A column of riders approached from the north, their dust trail curling like smoke. Violet's face went pale. She didn't need to see their brands to know who they were. Who are they? Silas asked, tightening his grip on the rifle. Violet swallowed hard, her voice almost breaking. They're here for me. The morning sun barely touched the rooftops of Cedar Ridge when the first gunshot cracked through the silence. Chickens scattered, shutters slammed, and the smell of black powder drifted down Main Street. Violet Monroe froze mid-step outside the Mercantile, the hem of her skirt brushing against the dust. She knew that sound too well. Not the reckless blast of a drunk, but the sharp warning of men who came to collect. 5 riders thundered through town, their horses lathered with sweat. Eyes wild, townsfolk scattered into doorways, peering through cracks like mice watching wolves. The riders fired into the air, bullets splintering the sign above the blacksmith's forge. One of them, a lean man with a scar slicing across his jaw, dismounted and nailed a note to the post outside the saloon. "She belongs to us," he shouted, his voice echoing, "and we'll burn this town to the ground if she ain't delivered by sundown." The words hung like smoke, thick and choking. Silence followed, broken only by the nervous stamping of hooves. Silas Kane stood across the street, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. His eyes cut to Violet, whose face had gone pale beneath her rouge. The past she had tried to bury had arrived on horseback. Silas, the choice of a silas, had lived his life by rules as old as the land itself. Work hard, protect what's yours, and don't invite trouble you can't bury. But now trouble sat squarely on his doorstep, staring at him with Violet Monroe's haunted eyes. He had promised himself he wouldn't get tangled in her mess. She was temporary, nothing more than a misplaced shadow until the real bride arrived. But when he saw the fear flash across her face, buried under her defiance, something twisted inside him. He couldn't hand her over, not to men who carried guns and eyes that gleamed with cruelty. Yet he knew the cost. Cedar Ridge was a town balanced on the edge of survival. One bad harvest, one raid, one fire, and it could tumble into ruin. If he shielded Violet, he risked not only his ranch but the fragile lives of every soul who called the town home. Silas tightened his jaw, the decision gnawing at him. Was she worth the ruin that followed? Violet. Ghosts of Dodge City. Violet hadn't slept since she stepped off that wagon. Nightmares kept her eyes wide in the dark. Memories of Dodge City's back alleys, of Frank Carraway's cold smile as he tossed cards across the table, promising her freedom for one more favor, one more secret. She had given him both. And then she had taken something from him, something he could never forgive. Not gold, not whiskey, but knowledge. Violet had overheard plans whispered in drunken confidence. A bank scheme in Kansas, names of men on the take, a ledger that could ruin Carraway's empire. She had run with that knowledge, run until her feet bled, knowing he would hunt her until one of them was in the ground. And now here he was, not in the flesh, not yet, but in the men he sent like hounds. Violet had always believed she deserved the hatred she earned, but for the first time, standing in Cedar Ridge, she felt the weight of dragging others into her storm. The town turns be noon. The saloon was thick with voices, the air hot and sour with whiskey and fear. Men argued over what to do. "Hand her over," one shouted, slamming his mug down. "Ain't no reason for the rest of us to bleed for a whore." "Ain't right," another muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Turning over a woman to outlaws ain't Christian. Ain't Christian letting them burn us down neither." The sheriff, a man with tired eyes and a badge that had lost its shine, raised his hands. "This ain't up for debate. Kane, you brought her here. You best figure how to fix it. Else..." This town'll do it for you. Silas stood at the back, arms folded, jaw like stone. Violet beside him felt every eye cutting her to ribbons. She wanted to tell them she wasn't worth saving, that she'd leave before another child cried or another rancher lost sleep. But the words caught in her throat, strangled by something she couldn't name. A desperate need for someone, anyone, to believe she could be more than the ruin she dragged behind her. Silas and Violet, a fragile bond. That evening, back at the Kane ranch, the world seemed too quiet. The cattle lowed restlessly in the distance, sensing danger. Silas sat at the kitchen table, oil lamp flickering across his weathered face. "Tell me the truth," he said, voice low, steady as a coiled rope. "Who are they?" Violet stared. At her hands, nails chipped, skin still smelling faintly of rosewater and smoke. "They're men who don't forgive," she whispered. "Men who'd rather burn the earth than let me breathe free." Silas's eyes searched hers. "What did you take from them?" Violet met his gaze, her mask slipping for the first time. "Their pride," she said. "Their secrets. Men like that don't bleed easy, Kane, and they don't stop coming." Silas leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Then we'll be ready." Violet laughed, a brittle sound. "You'd risk your life for me? For a woman the whole town curses?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Maybe I'm cursed too. Maybe that's why I can't turn away." The silence that followed was heavy, but beneath it ran a current neither of them dared name. Cliffhanger. The bride arrives the next morning. Cedar Ridge awoke to the rattle of another wagon rolling into town. Silas stood on the boardwalk, rifle in hand, Violet a step behind him. When the door swung open, a young woman stepped down, her blonde hair braided, her blue dress stiff with the dust of travel. In her hands she clutched a small satchel, and her eyes widened at the sight of Silas. "Mr. Kane?" she asked, her voice carrying the lilt of Norway. "I am Eleanor, your bride." Violet felt the air leave her lungs. The proper bride had arrived at last, and she had walked straight into a storm already raging. The morning heat clung to the boards of the Kane Ranch porch, the air thick with tension sharp enough to slice skin. Silas Kane stood rooted to the spot, his hands resting on his hips as two women faced each other across the worn wooden steps. On the left stood Violet Monroe, her copper hair catching sunlight like flames, the soft rouge on her lips nearly smudged, away from sleepless nights. A black dress hugged her form, worn at the seams but defiant, much like the woman herself. On the right stood Eleanor Lindstrom, the Norwegian bride Silas had written letters to for nearly a year. She was a vision of quiet grace, her pale blue dress still creased from travel, her small hands clasped tightly at her waist. Innocence clung to her like morning dew, and between them stood Silas, silent as a grave marker, watching two worlds collide. Violet's gaze was cool, steady, but beneath it churned storms she couldn't name. Eleanor's lower lip trembled as she clutched her satchel tighter, her voice soft but steady. "Mr. Kane," she said finally, "who is this woman living in your home?" Silas drew in a long breath, dragging it through his teeth before answering. "She's not who you think she is. She came off the wrong wagon." Violet laughed softly, not out of humor, but because anything else might shatter her. "Don't worry, darling," she said, voice smooth as whiskey poured over ice. "I ain't his bride. I ain't anyone's bride." But the words tasted bitter on her tongue. Violet and Eleanor, mirrors and rivals, for the next few days the Kane Ranch became a powder keg. Violet worked alongside Silas, feeding chickens and hauling water, her skirts dust-stained and her patience thin. Eleanor shadowed her, polite but sharp-eyed, as though cataloging every flaw. At supper, silence stretched across the table until it grew unbearable. Eleanor ate in small, careful bites while Violet chewed like a woman who'd learned hunger the hard way. "You write beautifully," Eleanor said one evening, breaking the quiet. "Your letters made me dream of this place." She glanced at Silas, her cheeks blooming with shy color. "Of a life together." Violet set her fork down with deliberate care. "Then it must have been a shock," she murmured. "Finding me sitting where you thought you'd be." Eleanor stiffened, her gaze darting to Silas, who suddenly found great interest in the grain of the tabletop. There it was, the thing none of them could say out loud. Violet was an intruder, a disruption, a ghost rattling chains in a house Eleanor thought was hers. And yet, when Silas's eyes drifted toward Violet across the lamplight, it wasn't Eleanor who caught his breath. The outlaw threat grew cedar. Ridge had gone uneasy since the gang's warning. Shutters stayed latched even in daylight, and children no longer chased one another through the dirt streets. Rumors whispered their way through the saloon. Frank Carraway himself was coming to finish what his men started one night. As Silas checked the fences along the north pasture, a shadow stepped from behind a mesquite tree, tall, lean, with braids threaded in red cloth and a rifle slung over his shoulder. "You're being watched," Chaska said quietly. Silas knew him by name, though they'd spoken only once before. A Lakota scout who'd drifted through Cedar Ridge seasons. Ago. He carried himself like a man carved from silence. "Watched?" Silas frowned. Chaska's dark eyes swept across the rolling hills. "Carraway's men ain't hiding their tracks. They want you to know they're close." He hesitated, then added, "And they've made allies. Colton Ryder rides with them now." Silas cursed under his breath. Ryder owned the largest cattle spread south of the ridge, a man notorious for running smaller ranchers into the dirt. If he'd thrown in with Carraway, this wasn't just about Violet anymore. It was about land, power, and control. Violet's secret revealed later that night. Silas confronted Violet by the corral, the lantern between them painting their faces in gold and shadow. "Why's Carraway after you?" he demanded. "It ain't just money." Violet hesitated, her hands tightening on the fence rail until her knuckles whitened. "He ain't just after me," she whispered. "He's my half-brother, Silas." The words hung in the air, heavy and wild. Silas stared, trying to fit the pieces together. Violet's bitterness, her secrets, the cold fire in her eyes whenever she spoke of Carraway. It all snapped into place. "He wants the ledger," she continued, her voice low and fierce. "He killed men for it, Silas. And I took it from him. If he gets it back, he owns half the territory. If he doesn't, he'll burn everything until there's nothing left." Silas stepped closer, his voice rough. "Then we'll hide it." Violet shook her head, tears glinting in the lantern light. "You don't understand. He'll kill you. He'll kill everyone." The triangle tightened as danger pressed closer, so did hearts. Silas found himself drawn to Violet in quiet, stolen moments. The brush of her hand against his when passing plates. The way her laugh, rare and soft, cracked through the weight he carried. But Eleanor watched from the shadows, her heart breaking, with each glance that wasn't hers to receive. One evening, as the prairie wind rattled the shutters, Eleanor found Violet by the barn, sharpening a knife. "He writes to me for a year," Eleanor said, her accent thickening with the weight of her anger. "And yet when I arrive, it is you he looks at." Violet didn't look up. "I didn't ask for his eyes, sweetheart." "Then give them back." Violet laughed, low, bitter, tired. "You think it's that simple? I tried walking away from men like him my whole damn life. But when he looks at me..." She stopped, swallowing hard. "He makes me want to stay." Neither spoke after that. The wind carried the silence between them. Cliffhanger. Fire in the night that night. The Kane ranch woke to the stench of smoke and the crackle of flames. The stables burned like torches against the dark sky, horses screaming inside their stalls. Silas grabbed his rifle, shouting orders as Violet and Eleanor hauled buckets from the well. Shadows moved on the ridge, riders silhouetted against the firelight, watching, waiting. Chaska appeared out of the darkness, rifle in hand. "They're testing your defenses," he said grimly. "Next time they won't just burn barns." Violet's breath came ragged, her gaze locked on the riders retreating into the night. She knew who had sent them. Frank Carraway was coming. The screams of horses split the silence long before the first shot rang out. By the time Silas Kane bolted from his bed, the night sky was already alight, a hellish orange glow spilling across the horizon. The stables were on fire, flames curling up into the dark like the fingers of some vengeful god. The smell of burning hay clawed at his throat as he yanked on his boots and grabbed his rifle. Violet Monroe was already outside, skirts hitched above her knees, hauling buckets from the well as sparks drifted down like dying stars. "Get the horses out," Silas barked, voice ragged over the roar of the fire. The livestock screamed inside, the collapsing stalls, hooves hammering against wood as smoke poured out in thick, choking waves. Eleanor stumbled out behind Violet, coughing, dragging a sack of feed she'd soaked in water to try and beat back the flames. In the chaos, Silas spotted them, dark silhouettes lined along the ridge, motionless, watching the blaze they'd started. Riders. He lifted his rifle, but before he could aim, one of the figures raised a torch high into the air, as if daring him to fire. Then they turned and vanished into the night. Loss and rage. By dawn, the Kane ranch lay in ruins. The stables had collapsed entirely, taking 6 horses with them. Half the winter feed was gone, scorched black and useless. The smell of smoke clung to everything. Hair, clothes, breath. Silas stood in the wreckage, his shoulders slumped under the weight of what he'd lost. "This ain't random," Chaska said, crouched low as he traced hoofprints in the dirt. His voice was quiet but certain. "They want you scared, they want you broke before they come to finish it." Silas said nothing. His jaw worked as he stared at the blackened skeleton of his stables. Violet approached slowly, soot streaked across her cheek, her copper hair tangled and damp with sweat. "Silas," she began softly. He turned on her, sharp as a whip crack. "You bring this trouble here, don't think I don't know it." Her lips parted, but no words came. Eleanor, standing a few paces away, stepped forward. "Don't talk to her like that," she said, voice trembling, but firm. "She's not the one who lit the fire." Silas turned his gaze on Eleanor, softer, but still heavy. "No, but she's why they're here." Violet swallowed hard, fighting the sting behind her eyes. She'd always known her past would catch her eventually, but she hadn't expected it to take others down with her. Violet's breaking point. That night Violet sat alone on the porch steps, knees drawn to her chest, watching embers drift lazily across the horizon where the stables once stood. She'd built her whole life on running, from Dodge City, from Caraway, from the ghosts she left behind. But now there was nowhere left to go. Eleanor approached quietly, carrying 2 mugs of black coffee. She sat without a word, passing one over. After a long silence, Eleanor spoke. "You love him," she said simply. Violet stared into her mug, the bitter scent rising into the cold night air. "Don't matter if I do," she murmured. "Ain't the kind of man who deserves someone like me." "You think you decide that?" Eleanor's voice softened. "You think you get to tell him who to love?" Violet laughed, hollow and quiet. "He deserves peace and I ain't peace, I'm a war following on 2 legs." Eleanor didn't reply. Instead, she reached into her skirt pocket and pulled out one of Silas's old letters, folded and worn from the road. "He wrote this in February," she said, handing it over. "Read it." Violet hesitated before unfolding the letter. Silas's handwriting sprawled across the page, rough but deliberate. He'd written about loneliness, about cold nights, about wanting something, someone, to make life feel worth living again. For the first time in years, Violet felt tears slide down her cheeks. Secrets in the ashes. The next day, Chaska returned from scouting the northern trails, his expression grim. "Caraway's men are camped 12 miles out," he said, setting his rifle against the wall. "But they ain't alone. Ryder's riders are with them." Silas frowned. "Ryder wouldn't take sides unless he saw profit in it." "He sees plenty," Chaska said. "Word is Caraway promised him Kane land once you're gone." Violet stiffened, setting down the pail she'd been carrying. "They won't stop," she said, her voice shaking despite her best effort to keep it steady. Silas turned to her sharply. "Then you better tell me everything. Right now." She hesitated, then nodded, drawing a deep breath. "The ledger," she whispered. Caraway keeps a record of every bribe, every payoff, every backroom deal he ever made. Politicians, sheriffs, bankers. It's all in there. I took it. Chaska's brow furrowed. Where is it now? Violet glanced toward the floorboards beneath the kitchen table. Silas cursed softly. You hid it here? I thought no one would look for it in the house of a rancher dumb enough to order a bride, she said bitterly. Betrayal in Cedar Ridges. If the fire wasn't enough, Cedar Ridge turned mean. Whispers spread like wildfire, names spat in alleyways and across saloon tables. Kane's hiding a whore, one man sneered. Bringing danger to every doorstep. He's got no right asking us for help, another said. He brought this war. By dusk, the preacher called a meeting at the chapel. The small room swelled with townsfolk, fear sharp in the air. We give her up, the preacher said, his voice ringing with false righteousness. One woman's life for the safety of many. God will forgive us. A few murmured agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to speak against him. Silas stood, his shadow tall against the lamplight. You hand her over, he said, voice low and dangerous. And you may as well sign your own death warrants. Caraway don't stop at one body. He'll bleed this land dry till there ain't nothing left. A tense silence followed. It was Eleanor who finally broke it, stepping forward, her voice clear despite her trembling hands. If Violet goes, she said, I go too. Every head turned. Violet stared at her, stunned, as Eleanor lifted her chin defiantly. You want a scapegoat, she said. You'll have to find another. Cliffhanger. Violet taken that night as the house slept. Shadows moved silently across the yard. Violet stirred awake to the creak of the porch boards. Too soft for Silas, too careful for Eleanor. She slipped from bed and reached for the knife under her pillow. Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth. Rough arms yanked her from the room, dragging her into the cold night air. The last thing she saw was Silas's lantern flaring to life as the outlaws vanished into the darkness with her. Her scream never made it past their hands. At first he thought it was exhaustion weighing on his bones, the lingering fog of too little sleep and too much loss. But then his hand reached instinctively across the bed to where Violet had been, and his fingers found nothing but cold, tangled sheets. He sat up sharply, breath hitching, heart pounding in his chest. The lantern beside the bed still burned low, throwing fragile shadows against the walls, but the room was empty. A single boot print marred the wood by the doorframe. The porch boards creaked under weight that was no longer there. Then he saw it. Near the open window, a knife discarded on the floor, its blade slick with a single drop of blood that glimmered orange in the lantern light. She hadn't gone willingly. Rage like wildfire by dawn. Silas was saddled up, rifle slung across his back, jaw tight enough to crack bone. He stood in the yard, staring north where the hills rolled like sleeping beasts under a pale gray sky. Beyond them lay the outlaw camp, 12 miles into Badlands, crawling with men who'd as soon gut you as look at you. Eleanor stood on the porch steps, wringing her hands, her braid undone, hair wild around her pale face. Silas, she whispered, you can't do this alone. He turned, eyes burning with something deeper than anger. Ain't got a choice. Yes, you do. Her voice trembled, but she stood her ground. You ride out there alone, you die. And she dies anyway. Silas hesitated, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. Behind them, Chaska approached silently, reins in hand, his face carved from stone. She's right, he said quietly. You'll need more than bullets. You'll need eyes, and you'll need allies who know how Caraway thinks. Silas studied the Lakota scout, the fire in his chest dimming just enough to let reason through. You know where they're headed? Chaska nodded once. I can track them, but if we go now. Every hour she stays with him. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. A reluctant posse by mid-morning. The Kane ranch yard was alive with preparation. 3 horses saddled, packs loaded with jerky, ammunition, and canteens, and one unexpected addition. The sheriff, badge tarnished, hands shaking, slightly as he adjusted the strap of his rifle, rode into the yard with a grim expression. Don't look so surprised, he muttered when Silas frowned. Caraway made me into a coward once. Maybe I get to undo that today. Silas gave a short nod, respect passing between them unspoken. But the fourth rider was the one Silas hadn't expected. Eleanor. She stood by the corral, cinching a saddle onto a gray mare, her blue dress tucked into borrowed trousers, a revolver resting on her hip. Absolutely not, Silas said, striding toward her. She didn't look up. Absolutely yes. This ain't your fight. Eleanor turned, meeting his gaze head-on for the first time since she'd arrived. You made it my fight when you brought me here, she said simply. I can shoot. I can ride. And if you think I'll sit here waiting to find out if she's dead or alive, you don't know me at all. Violet's name hung between them, unspoken but heavier than lead. Silas clenched his jaw, but in the end he said nothing. He simply adjusted her stirrups and handed her an extra box of ammunition. Violet, prisoner of ghosts, Violet road-bound, on the back of a sorrel mare, wrists chafed raw from the coarse rope biting into her skin. Her captors laughed and spat around her, their voices rough and jagged, full of a cruelty she knew too well. She kept her head down, eyes on the dust rising from the horse's hooves, but every word they spoke sank into her like barbed wire. Caraway's gonna be pleased, one drawled. Reckon he'll make a show of her. Another laughed, low and ugly. Reckon he'll make us watch. Violet swallowed hard, her throat dry, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Panic wouldn't save her. Not now. When the campfire crackled to life that night, Violet sat on the edge of the circle, wrists still bound, staring into the flames while the men passed a bottle around. The leader of her captors, a broad-shouldered man with pale gray eyes and a scar curling up from his collarbone, crouched in front of her, his breath hot with whiskey. Miss Monroe, he drawled, mocking politeness. You know why Caraway's so riled up, don't you? Violet raised her chin, refusing to answer. He leaned closer, voice dropping low. It ain't just about that ledger. Nah, see, he's been telling folks for years you was his property. And now, he gets to make good on that claim. Violet's stomach turned, but she didn't flinch. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Deep inside, though, she prayed Silas was coming. The desert tests them all. The posse rode hard, days blurring into one another beneath an unforgiving sun. Dust clung. To their skin, sweat stung their eyes, and every breath tasted like grit. Water ran low, tempers ran shorter. At night, they camped beneath endless skies littered with stars, the silence broken only by the crackle of firewood and distant coyote howls. Eleanor cleaned her revolver with deliberate precision, refusing to meet Silas's gaze. Chaska studied the horizon, always alert, always listening. The sheriff drank too much from his flask and muttered apologies to ghosts no one else could see. And Silas lay awake, staring at the stars, thinking of Violet's laugh, her fire, her pain, and how the world had no right to take her from him after all she'd survived. Violet's gambit Violet wasn't waiting to be saved. On the third night, she managed to loosen the ropes at her wrists while the men slept, the fire dying. Low, she slipped her hands free, fingers numb and trembling, and reached for the scarred man's revolver where it rested near his bedroll. But just as her fingers brushed the grip, a shadow fell across her. Frank Caraway himself stood there, pale, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Thought you'd run again, little sister, he said softly. Don't. You know how that ends. Violet froze, every muscle locking tight as his hand cupped her chin, forcing her to look at him. You're gonna give me what you stole, he murmured, voice smooth and deadly. And then, you're gonna pay. She spat in his face. He smiled. Reckon you still got some fight left in you. Good. Cliffhanger. The execution be dawn. The gang dragged Violet to the center of the outlaw camp, binding her hands to a rough-hewn post. Caraway stood before her, the ledger open in his hand, the weight of her betrayal thick in the air. You had your chance, he said coldly. Now they all get to watch you die. Violet's chest rose and fell rapidly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. And that's when she saw them. 4 riders cresting the ridge, silhouettes against the bleeding dawn. Silas, he'd come for her. But 4 against 20? Her breath caught. Hope and terror tangled tight in her chest as Caraway raised his hand to give the order. Killer! The sun hadn't yet risen, but the horizon burned red. As though the heavens themselves bled for what was about to happen, Silas Kane sat astride his horse on the ridge, staring down at the outlaw camp sprawled across the valley floor. A haze of smoke from dying campfires curled into the pale dawn, carrying the scent of whiskey, sweat, and blood. Below, Violet Monroe stood bound to a rough-hewn post, her copper hair tangled and wild, face streaked with dirt and defiance. Frank Caraway loomed beside her, his pale gray eyes flat as cold steel, one hand resting lazily on the butt of his revolver. 20 men milled about the camp, armed and restless, boots crunching dry soil as they shifted into position. Silas counted rifles, the angles of cover, every advantage stacked against them. 4 riders against 20. No chance. And yet, he'd come. Because leaving Violet behind was no longer an option. Unbroken, Violet's wrists ached from the rope biting into her skin, but her gaze never left the horizon where the riders had appeared. She'd known Silas would come. Somewhere deep in her bones she'd always known. But now that he was here, dread and hope twisted together until she could hardly breathe. Frank leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. "See that, little sister?" he murmured, voice soft and cruel. "Man's riding straight to his grave for you." Violet turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. "Maybe," she whispered, "but at least he ain't dying a coward." His jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw something flicker in those pale eyes. Not anger, but something older, deeper, maybe guilt. But it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold smile. "Then he can die first," Frank said. The ride into hell. Silas glanced once at Chaska, then at Eleanor and the sheriff. Each of them nodded, silent understanding passing between them. "We get her out," Silas said, voice low but steady. "No matter what it takes." Chaska's dark eyes narrowed, scanning the camp below. "We draw fire first. Make 'em scatter." "I can shoot," Eleanor said, jaw set, knuckles white around her revolver. Silas hesitated, but she met his gaze unflinching. "Fine," he said finally. "Stay behind me." And then they rode. Horses thundered down the ridge, hooves tearing up the earth, rifles cracking as the first shot split the dawn. The camp erupted into chaos, men shouting, diving for cover, smoke rising in curls from the first burst of gunfire. Silas fired twice, dropping a man near the water barrels, then slid from the saddle and rolled behind an overturned wagon. "Move!" he shouted to Eleanor, who darted behind a pile of crates, revolver already in her. And Chaska took to higher ground, climbing a rocky outcrop where his rifle barked sharp and fast. The sheriff crouched low, muttering under his breath as he reloaded, hands steady despite the bullets whining past his head. The air filled with heat and gun smoke, the acrid sting of it catching in every breath. And still, Violet watched, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Violet's choice. Amid the chaos, Caraway grabbed Violet's arm and yanked her close, pressing the barrel of his revolver to her temple. "Call him off," he snarled, "or I'll put you in the ground right here." Violet stared at him, unblinking. "You do it," she said softly, "and that ledger dies with me." His grip faltered just slightly. That was all she needed. She stomped hard on his boot, twisted free of his hold, and grabbed the knife from his belt in a single motion. The next moment was a blur, his roar, her lunge, the blade flashing in the dawn light. But before steel met flesh, another shot cracked through the air, striking the ground between them. Both froze, turning toward the sound. Eleanor stood there, revolver smoking, tears streaking her face. "Let her go," she said, voice shaking but steady enough to be believed. The duel time slowed. Frank Caraway straightened, brushing dust from his coat, his pale eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "You always were stubborn, Violet," he said, drawing his revolver. "Reckon I gotta break you myself." Silas stepped into the open, rifle lowered, gaze locked on Caraway. "It ain't her you want," Silas said quietly. "It's me." Frank laughed. "You? You're just a rancher too dumb to quit." Maybe, Silas replied, but I'm the man standing between you and her. He let the rifle fall and drew his revolver. Caraway's grin widened. Reckon we settle this old-fashioned then? For a long heartbeat, the world held its breath. 2 men, 1 woman worth dying for. The sky bled red behind them as they faced each other in the dust. Then Caraway moved first, ashes and blood. The shot was deafening, the recoil jarring up Silas's arm, but he didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. He fired again, and again, until Caraway staggered back, a look of surprise frozen on his face. He fell without a sound, dust rising around him like smoke. Silence crashed over the camp. The remaining outlaws hesitated, leaderless, eyes darting between Silas and the dead man at his feet. Chaska fired a single warning shot into the air. "Leave," he barked. One by one, they did. The sheriff lowered his rifle. Eleanor sank to her knees, sobs finally breaking free. Violet stood frozen, chest heaving, staring down at the man who had haunted every mile of her life. Gone, just like that. The aftermath be sunset. The posse rode back into Cedar Ridge, battered, but alive. The townsfolk stared in silence as they passed, at Violet sitting tall in the saddle despite her bruises, at Silas streaked with blood and dust, at Eleanor, quiet and pale but unbroken. There were no cheers. Only the quiet understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. That night, under a bruised purple sky, Silas stood with Violet on the porch of the Kane ranch. "He's gone," she whispered, voice raw. Silas nodded, his hand brushing hers. "So's you're running." She swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "Don't know who I am without it." "Maybe," he said softly. "That's what we figure out. Together." Behind them, Eleanor watched from the window, unseen, her heart breaking, quietly in the dark. Final twist, a letter from the past days later. As Violet unpacked the few belongings she still owned, she found an envelope tucked deep into the lining of her bag. The handwriting stopped her cold. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the letter. "Violet, if you're reading this, I'm dead. There are things you don't know. Things about who you are, and who your mother was. Caraway wasn't the only one with claims on your blood." She read the final line twice, her breath catching in her throat. "They'll come for you next." Violet lowered the letter slowly, staring out across the plains as the wind howled low and mournful through the grass. Whatever peace she thought she'd found was already unraveling.